So I was never really a big NES guy, and so I was unfamiliar with the world of Bayou Billy until you shared that video with me. Was this something you were familiar with already?
Oh yeah, this was a game that I owned, and in fact, now that I have the Retron, which is what I used my credits from the returned RG 35XX to purchase, I have a couple of NES cartridges, and I actually just picked up a couple more. I got Jaws, which I've always been a
Oh,
big fan
nice.
of, and for my wife, I got California games, which I am not good at, apparently. So never really played the NES version of that. But I was considering picking up Bayou Billy because that was a game that I did own originally. And it was a game that I loved and also incredibly frustrated me. It's a game that I've talked to a lot of people about. Some people know it, some people don't. But it's really cool because even at the time, I remember thinking that it was so far advanced compared to what was coming out on NES technologically, compared to what was coming out on NES, even compared to stuff that came in the few years after that. This seemed so far beyond what those games were doing. I mean, this came out at a time when a lot of NES games still had just a black background and you were just characters, or a solid color background like Mario. You were just a character moving along the screen. I mean, this had side scrolling beat 'em up levels. This had light gun shooting levels. It had driving levels. It was crazy. But it's also the bane of a lot of people's existences because this is what started the punishing, officially started the punishing difficulty that NES was known for and games of that time were known for, because Konami, being one of the major game companies at the time, realized that the rental business was getting bigger and they didn't want people to be able to just rent their game and beat it in a weekend. They wanted them to rent it, see how cool it was, and have to continue with the game. So they were just going to have to buy the game rather than rent it a few times. It would just be cheaper at a certain point to buy the physical cartridge of it. So this is when that difficulty just went off the deep end for so many games. So sort of like what happened a few years later with Double Dragon 3. Double Dragon 3 was the first game to have microtransactions in it. So for everybody who hates that and hates DLC and having to pay things after the fact, that actually started in the early 90s with Double Dragon 3. In the actual arcade, you had to buy power-ups and weapons by putting extra quarters into the arcade cabinet. So this is when the insane difficulty started. So you hadn't heard about this game at all?
No, I had not. So I did some, as we're noted for deep research, kind of running through on it, and super impressed with the gameplay. It's obviously present on my Super Console X, so I've gotten a little bit of experience that way as well. Um, from it, to your point, for an NES game, super advanced. I mean, when if we ever do a game, the Bog Panda rating on this game, for the platform, particularly in the kind of walk and punch level, uh, really strong for the platform. The light gun level or D-pad level, decent, and then probably the driving one, a little weaker for me in terms of visual, but still for the time and for all of that, and for three very distinct different kinds of gameplay, they pulled a lot off with this. So it was pretty fun. I did see that there are the characters that show up. There's usually maybe a little bit of history or connection, just to the right side of copyright violation on certain things. I saw a lot of stuff where they were saying the main character was basically Indiana Jones. I disagree. I think it was Hillbilly Jim from the World Wrestling Federation. That's a little bit more what I get. But that just may be my frame of reference. But I mean, he not quite as stout, but he had a much stronger Hillbilly Jim vibe than um, Raiders of the Lost Ark for me.
Yeah, I mean there's elements in this game, and I remember even as a kid, like I wasn't aware of copyrights and things, but I could definitely see influence of things in there because I was at the age where, like, okay, I'd seen Indiana Jones, I'd seen Crocodile Dundee, I'd seen reruns of Dukes of Hazzard, so I could see where they were pulling obvious reference points from for certain things. Particularly in a lot of the artwork on the box and things like that, you get a strong, strong Crocodile Dundee vibe to that. He is, using a whip, I guess, is where the Indiana Jones stuff comes from. Um, and then the setting and the boss, you get a little bit more Dukes of Hazzard kind of thing, where it's set in the Deep South, which obviously is not Crocodile Dundee or Indiana Jones.
Oh, straight super deep south.
No, that's true.
Depending how you count it. But
The ultra Deep South.
yeah, yeah, but hillbilly, still more hillbilly Jim than Crocodile Dundee too, for me. So somewhere between the nexus of Indiana Jones, Crocodile Dundee, and Hillbilly Jim lies Bayou Billy. So he can. So he's in super safe copyright violation land. He's just
Yeah, just hitting
amalgamation.
all those copyrights at the same time.
That's right.
If you hit all the copyrights, they can't get. I guess that was their if you offend everyone kind
That's
of
right.
thing.
It's like, no, we're not copying Indiana Jones. We're copying Crocodile Dundee. Depends on which case.
Yeah.
Good plan. Solid plan.
And this is a reworking of a game called Mad City. And I've never played Mad City, but I know it's not just reskinned like some of these things are. Like the difficulty is dramatically altered, weapons are changed, and things like that too. So I'd always heard that this was very different. Whereas a lot of other, westernized versions of games are maybe just reskinning a character and westernizing the dialogue. This apparently is heavily altered from its original source material. Also, too, speaking of dialogue, this game blew my little kid mind. When you turn it on, it starts talking. It says the name of the game, and the characters, it's one or two words here and there, but the characters speak in the game. That was not a thing that existed on home consoles at that time. And especially, even if you got one or two words in a game, it was impressive. But this was like lines of dialogue. There's some, and I remember it being like in the advertising materials that there's like 50 different words that they say or something like that. That seemed mind blowing at the time. Now, of course, you have minutes of, cutscenes with full orchestration and dialogue and things like that. But at that time, that was insane. This was like watching a movie on your NES at that point.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and the gameplay looks great, and if it makes to my minimal experience with it enjoyable. Does I think the punishingly hard uh, tag is fair? From early exposure, it's like I think I'm in a little trouble here. This game's not gonna go well for me. But no, it was excellent. It was a great recommendation. I do think I want to gain a little more experience with it to give it a fair shake in a full-blown game review show. But if our viewers haven't seen it, and speaking of our viewers, we might probably mention at this point in time, in addition to this kind of fine content, don't forget on the Bog Panda YouTube channel, you can listen to Hard No, the world's shortest podcast. So you probably want to check that out too. But um, be interested to hear from the folks watching if this is a favorite of theirs. So would you say from your NES era, this is in kind of your upper tier of games?
Yeah, I mean, from a technical standpoint, it was very frustrating as a kid because it was a hard game. It wasn't until I revisited it years later, like not long before I got rid of my original NES, that I was able to even play through the whole game. I remember being just really frustrating, getting stuck early in the game, eventually getting a little bit further and playing some of the other stages, but it wasn't until years later, right before I got rid of the NES, that I actually played through this full game. Um, so that was frustrating. So I wouldn't say it was my favorite game, but from a technical standpoint, it's certainly one of the best on the system. Even games that came years after this never really quite did all the tricks that this did. And by the time there was games that had more voice samples, that had different styles of gameplay, it wasn't as impressive anymore. Similar to when we did our review of Road Rash, I don't think Road Rash looks good, and there are way better looking games for the system. But the reason that I gave it 5 pandas for the visuals is because at that time, people didn't think Sega could do that. The way it was handling scaling, rotation, and things like that. As far as people knew, it just wasn't possible on the hardware. So kind of the same thing with this. There are some games that look a little more polished that came later, and certainly that play a little bit better. But at that time, you were just seeing all this crazy stuff that you didn't think Nintendo could do.
Definitely cool. So before we wrap up, a game of breaking barriers and those types of things. Rumor has it you may be in the game development business these days. I didn't know if you wanted to make any comments as you look at it from that angle or not.
Yeah, so I mean, you and I are both, I would say, very amateur game developers. But I mean, we're doing stuff like I'm proud of us and how far that we've come. But I do feel like you threw down the gauntlet, questioning the amount of effort that maybe went into some of my offerings into our little gaming universe. So I've assembled a team complete with montage music and all that good stuff, like any good '80s action movie. I've assembled a team, and we're doing something I think it's a little bit more impressive that I couldn't do on my own, not at this point anyway. But I have really cool people helping me out, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I think it's going to answer the prayers of so many in the Bog Panda army. They're finally going to be able to control Kelly Tool himself in a game.
That's what they've been waiting for. So, but hey, hope you folks enjoyed this content. If you did, please consider subscribing to the Bog Panda YouTube channel. Hit that bell so you know when new episodes come out. And while you're there, maybe you want to check out our merch store. We've got some t-shirts and such for there too. So that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bog Panda.